Hello, what's up? This video is going to be a short, brief introduction to telling you what is an invasive species and what is an exotic/introduced species. A lot of you out there have heard of the term of invasive species, and that refers to a species of life form that can be an animal, a plant, a fungus, or any microorganism that is being released into a non-native or foreign habitat as a result of human activities, such as trade. And they are regarded as being invasive because they become harmful to that ecosystem and usually by outcompeting native species of wildlife. And they are also characterized by usually having a large numbers and being relatively widespread in that habitat due to the lack of any natural forces that controls their numbers. So here is an example of invasive species, the Eurasian carp or koi that is being introduced into the Mississippi River system. As the common name suggests, they came from the freshwater ecosystems of the Eurasian continent, and they were being introduced to the Mississippi River in North America as a result of irresponsible pet owners. And why they became invasive? Because they are highly adaptive, they are really resistant to pollution in the water, and they can eat a variety of foods. And they also reproduce in relatively large numbers. And then they successfully outcompeted native fish species for food and places for shelter, so they posed a huge threat to the native ecosystem. They led to the reduction of numbers of native fish species, and the Eurasian koi in North America is basically the freshwater fish equivalent of Pharaoh pigs. Another example would be the Melaleuca, the paper bark trees in Florida, where these trees actually originated in Australia. And they are adapted to warm subtropical or Mediterranean climates where the weather is relatively dry and natural wildfires are a part of the ecosystem. So they are really resistant to wildfires, and they are also relatively fast-growing trees, and they also reproduce in huge numbers by releasing a huge amounts of tiny small seeds the size of small grains of sand, and they are usually spread by the wind. Due to the nature of their growth and the similarities between the climate of Florida and parts of northern Australia, Melaleuca trees that were being introduced to Florida quickly outcompete certain native tree species such as the longleaf pine, replacing them in certain regions. And these Melaleuca trees are invasive because they are also really bad for the animals that relies on the longleaf pine forest, which would take away their nesting habitat and food resources. The third example would be the Mikania Micrantha plant that were native to Mesoamerica but being introduced into southern China. And they were being released there accidentally back in the early 19th century as a result of long-distance trade. This invasive plant species actually greatly reduced certain native tree species because it is a parasitic plant, which means it relies on a host for the energy it needs. It grows in a really dense and thick formation, blocking any sunlight from reaching the floor of the forest. And finally, the herbivorous animals in southern China do not eat this plant. So there are no any natural forces to keep their numbers in check there. And nowadays they are already being found as a common species there. They literally replace certain native plant species. What about the Pharaoh goats that are being released onto the island of Galapagos? Yes, goats are native to the Eurasian continent, and they are definitely not native to the ecosystem of the Galapagos Islands off the west coast of South America. Pharaoh goats are regarded as invasive to those islands is because they grow fast, they reproduce in large numbers, and they feed on the same food source as the giant tortoise of those islands, which means they both primarily feed on grasses and occasionally other plant materials. When put into comparison, the growth rate and reproduction rate of the giant tortoise of the Galapagos Islands are actually really slow. And those invasive mammals brought by the settlers just quickly outcompeted the tortoise for food, and they also outnumbered the tortoise, leading to those tortoise becoming an endangered species. Because their numbers reduced drastically, and it's also really difficult for their population to bounce back to the original size. The common name of this odd-looking exotic plant is called the mother of thousands or the devil's backbone, and is only native to a small region in the southwestern part of the island of Madagascar. It is characterized by a succulent nature which makes them really drought tolerant. It is adapted to growing in all kinds of soil, and it can also grow in places that lack soil, and most importantly, it can reproduce in a large numbers, both sexually and asexually. It is also known for being highly resistant to harsh weather. They had really few natural predators because they are poisonous to most herbivorous animals, and it is basically the definition of an indestructible noxious weed. And the mother of thousands plant had become an invasive species in any tropical or subtropical regions outside of Madagascar that they're being released to. It outcompetes various types of local shrubs, and it can also poison local herbivorous animals. And the tamarix is a genus of plants that are native to southern Russia, Central Asia, and the Middle East. They were being introduced to North America back in the 19th century, originally as a means to stop soil erosion, and since then, they were able to outcompete and even replace various types of native drought-tolerant plants such as the ephedra and the mesquite. They are also quite bad for the ecosystem is because they do not provide food or shelter for the local wildlife. They are fast growing and they are also highly adapted to poor soils, so that also allows their population to continuously spread in North America. But not all exotic or introduced species are harmful to the ecosystem that they are introduced to. Some of them can be entirely harmless. For example, the parrots that are being introduced to the east coast of North America. And parrots are long-lived and intelligent birds, thus they are mostly native to the South Hemisphere. And they won't become particularly invasive or destructive to a new ecosystem that they're being introduced to due to the fact that they also reproduces in a slow rate and they often distribute themselves in a clumped formation. The food they eat is also relatively specific, usually only certain types of fruits and seeds. That's why they cannot outcompete native species of birds. Another example would be most types of palm trees that are being planted in California. Except for the species of Washingtonia filifera, all other species of palm trees that you can see being planted in California are introduced there. But why they didn't outcompete native species of plant life is because the conditions of California is not particularly good for palm trees. Many species of them can definitely survive the soil and the climate there. Their growth rates are relatively slow, and their seeds also requires quite specific conditions to germinate. And most palms are really intolerant of wildfires, so it is really difficult for them to spread all over the place. So to conclude this video is that all invasive species are introduced species which are a result of human activities, but not all introduced species are invasive, which means they don't always pose a threat to the native ecosystem there. Where things like the intention of people releasing those life forms, the climate, or the geographical conditions of the region that they're being released to, and most importantly, the growth habits of those life forms determined if they are invasive or not. And once again, thank you for watching.